All right, so get ready because today we are going to tackle a question that has been stumping philosophers for like forever.
Yeah, this is a big one.
Do we actually have free will, or is it all an illusion? Are we really calling the shots, or is everything already predetermined?
Right.
Luckily, we've got some heavy hitters in our corner to help us wrestle with this. We'll be diving into Aristotle's Nicomachean ethics,
Ah, Aristotle.
and we'll also be bringing in some modern perspectives from Richard Sorabji and Suzanne Bobzien.
Sounds like a plan. It's always fascinating to see how these ideas, even ones from way back when, still resonate with us today.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So let's jump right in with Aristotle. In Nicomachean Ethics, he spends a good chunk of time dissecting the difference between voluntary and involuntary actions.
Yeah, and it can get pretty nuanced.
And this distinction ends up being super important when it comes to figuring out who's responsible for what.
Absolutely. He really lays the groundwork for moral responsibility with this. Like for Aristotle, the whole point of figuring out if an action is voluntary or not boils down to this. Did it come from within us, or was it caused by some outside force?
Okay, so if a gust of wind suddenly knocks me off my feet,
Whoops.
that's not a voluntary action.
Yeah, I mean, you didn't choose to fall.
Exactly. That's the wind's fault, not mine.
That's an external factor. But let's say you see someone struggling with a heavy bag and you decide to help them. That decision to lend a hand, that came from you, your own thought process and choice.
Okay, that makes sense. But how does this whole determinism thing fit into all of this? Doesn't the idea that everything's already predetermined kind of negate the possibility of free will? Because if everything's already set in stone, how can we really be responsible for anything we do?
That's the big question, right? It's like this constant tension. And Aristotle was very aware of it. He basically said, look, if we want actions to be truly voluntary, then determinism just can't be true. Because for him, there has to be a real possibility for us to have chosen otherwise, to have done things differently.
Okay, I'm starting to see the problem here. If everything we do is just a domino effect from some initial cause way back when, how can we praise someone for being generous or blame them for making a bad decision?
It's a tricky situation. Aristotle is saying that real choice is absolutely crucial for us to hold anyone accountable for anything. If our actions are just the inevitable outcome of some predetermined chain of events, it'd be like praising a tree for growing tall like it had any say in the matter.
So you're saying that, according to Aristotle, if there's no free will, there's no such thing as moral responsibility,
Right.
which throws a pretty big wrench into things like our entire legal system.
You got it. But even with all of that, Aristotle has a comeback for anyone who says determinism just erases responsibility altogether.
Oh, what's that?
He points to our ability to deliberate as evidence for free will.
Deliberation. You mean like weighing the pros and cons, thinking things through before making a choice?
Exactly. Aristotle was pretty sharp. He realized that we only deliberate about things that are actually up to us, things that we have the power to influence. You don't deliberate about the past, for instance, because what's done is done.
That's true. I don't spend time agonizing over what I had for breakfast yesterday. It's a done deal.
Right.
But I might go back and forth for a few minutes deciding between coffee or tea.
Exactly. And that internal debate, that's deliberation in action. And for Aristotle, that's a pretty good indicator that you genuinely have a choice. Like you're not just a puppet being pulled by strings of fate. You're an agent capable of considering possibilities and making a decision.
Okay, so deliberation is a clue that maybe, just maybe, we do have free will after all. But hold on, doesn't this whole idea of free will clash with the idea that our actions have causes, that they're influenced by all sorts of things outside our control?
Ah, good point. And this is where Richard Sorabji, who's a scholar of ancient philosophy, comes in with some interesting thoughts. He suggests that Aristotle might not have completely dismissed the idea of causation in human actions.
Wait, seriously. So even though Aristotle believed in free will, he also recognized that our choices are shaped by things outside of ourselves.
It seems that way. What Sorabji is pointing to is that Aristotle was dealing with this complex web of different factors, and he wasn't afraid of the complexity. Sorabji highlights this concept of a fresh start that Aristotle talks about, where even though our past experiences, the things we've been through, and even our circumstances can influence us, we still have this capacity to spark new chains of events.
So it's like we might be products of our past, but we're not prisoners of it.
Right.
We still have the power to make choices in the present that shape our future.
Exactly. It's this delicate dance, this interplay between determinism and free will, where all those external forces and our internal choices are constantly mixing and mingling. And what Sorabji is helping us see is how Aristotle was trying to reconcile these ideas of causation and accountability.
Okay, but how does that work in practice? How can we be held accountable for what we do if our actions are being influenced by things we can't control?
It is a brain twister, I'll give you that. But what Sorabji argues is that Aristotle sees us as the initiators of our own choices, even if those choices are nudged or shaped by external things. It's kind of like a ripple effect. An initial event might trigger a chain reaction, but we still have the power to direct those ripples, to choose how they spread and what kind of impact they make.
I see. So it's not just a one-way street.
Nope.
Okay, so we've got Aristotle making a case for free will based on our ability to deliberate, to think things through, and to initiate new actions, even though those actions can be influenced by stuff outside of our control. Where do we go from here?
Well, now that we've gotten a taste of Aristotle's perspective, I think it's time to throw a curveball into the mix.
Okay, hit me with it.
Let's talk about the Stoics and their unique approach to freedom. We'll be looking at how philosopher Suzanne Bobzien presents their view, and I think it's going to challenge some of the assumptions we've been working with.
All right, bring on the Stoics. I'm always up for a good philosophical shakeup. What makes their take on freedom so different?
Get ready for this because they basically flip the script on us. Instead of arguing for freedom from determinism, they actually embrace the idea that the universe is determined.
Wait, slow down a second. They believe that everything was predetermined. But how could you even talk about freedom if everything is already decided? It seems like a total contradiction.
And that's exactly what makes the Stoics so intriguing. They were like, okay, true freedom isn't about trying to control all the external events because that's mostly out of our hands.
That's a pretty humbling thought.
Right. Instead, they're saying it's all about mastering our internal responses to those events.
So not about changing the course of destiny, but changing how we react to it.
You got it. They called this idea living in accordance with nature, which basically means getting our own will in sync with the will of the universe. It's about accepting what we can't change and putting all our effort into what we can control. Our own thoughts, our perceptions, and ultimately our actions.
Wow, that's a pretty different angle compared to Aristotle's focus on voluntary actions. I'm already curious to see how this whole Stoic idea of freedom as inner harmony actually plays out in the real world. But maybe we should take a quick break before we tackle that.
All right, so let's see how these ancient ideas about free will play out in real life, everyday stuff. Let's take something like building habits. We're constantly getting advice on forming good habits, breaking bad ones, but how much control do we actually have over those processes?
That's a great point. Like, right now I'm trying to get better at exercising regularly, and some days it's like I'm totally in the zone.
Yeah.
I put on my workout clothes, head to the gym, and feel amazing afterward. But then there are other days where I just can't seem to find the motivation.
Oh, yeah.
And I end up glued to the couch scrolling through my phone. It's like this constant battle between, wanting to be healthy and, well, just wanting to relax.
I think we've all been there. That internal tug of war is something both Aristotle and the Stoics can actually help us understand. From Aristotle's perspective, building a new habit involves a whole bunch of voluntary actions. Each time you make a choice, it's like a tiny little exercise in free will.
So every time I choose to go for a run instead of hitting that snooze button,
Uh-huh.
I'm basically giving my free will muscles a workout.
You got it. Each choice you make strengthens the next one, and eventually those choices start to form a new pattern of behavior. But here's where the Stoics come in with this really useful piece of wisdom. They remind us that even if we have the best intentions in the world, we're going to run into resistance, internally. Those old habits, desires, and fears, they're pretty strong forces.
So the Stoics wouldn't be surprised by my ongoing struggle with the snooze button.
No, not at all. They'd see it as part of the human experience. But they also wouldn't say, just give in. Instead, they'd encourage you to notice those urges, without letting them control you. Create some space between the urge to hit snooze and actually hitting it.
So it's not about erasing those urges completely.
No, not really.
It's about learning how to handle them with a bit more awareness and choosing how we respond, recognizing that, hey, I might want to hit snooze, but I also want to get to the gym and feel good afterward. And I get to decide which one wins.
Exactly. That's the core of the Stoic approach, It's about cultivating that inner strength, that ability to choose our responses, even when we're facing some pretty intense pressure, whether it's coming from inside us or from the outside world.
This makes me think about how we make ethical choices, too. I mean, if everything's predetermined, like the Stoics believed, Do our moral decisions even matter? Does it even make a difference what we choose?
Wow, that's a question that has been echoing through philosophy for centuries. And to be honest, there's no easy answer. But I think both Aristotle and the Stoics offer us some helpful ways to think about it. Remember, Aristotle believed that we can be held accountable for our actions because we have that capacity to deliberate, to weigh our options, and choose a course of action.
Oh, right. So even if external factors are influencing our moral compass,
Right.
it's not like we're totally off the hook. We still have to make those choices and deal with what happens as a result.
And the Stoics add this really insightful layer to it. They're reminding us that even when we're in tough situations, when it feels like we have no options, we still have a choice about how we respond to those circumstances. We can choose to act with integrity, even when it's hard, even when it feels like the world is against us.
That's a powerful reminder.
Hmm.
So it's not about being in control of everything that happens to us, but choosing how we show up within those circumstances. That's where the real freedom is.
Yeah, that's it. And that leads us to this other big question, a question we're all facing in the modern world. How do we balance those external pressures and internal forces to actually live in a way that feels authentic? I mean, it feels like we're constantly bombarded with messages about who we should be, what we should be doing, what we should look like. It can be so hard to even figure out what we truly value, let alone actually live by those values.
Oh, tell me about it. It's like trying to navigate this minefield of social expectations, work demands, family stuff, and then our own inner critics on top of all that.
It's a lot.
It can be exhausting trying to figure out who you even are
Yeah.
amidst all that noise.
It really can. And this is where both Aristotle and the Stoics offer some surprisingly relevant wisdom, even though their ideas are thousands of years old. Remember Aristotle's emphasis on deliberation. He believed that living a good life involves regularly taking stock of our lives, questioning our assumptions, and making sure our actions are actually in line with our values.
So it's not enough to just go through the motions. We have to actually think about whether those motions are taking us where we want to go.
You got it. The Stoics would be totally on board with that. They'd be all about self awareness, understanding our own biases, desires, and fears. And they'd be big on cultivating this attitude of acceptance towards the stuff we just can't control, while putting all our energy into the things we can.
It sounds like both philosophies are encouraging us to step back from all the chaos of daily life and ask ourselves, what do I really care about? What kind of person do I want to be? And what choices will actually get me closer to that?
Those are the million-dollar questions, aren't they?
Yeah.
And, being honest about the answers requires a lot of courage, some serious self reflection, and a willingness to stand up to those external pressures that are trying to force us into a mold that might not even fit.
This has been such a thought-provoking conversation. It feels like we've been untangling this really intricate knot, but it's definitely been worth it. So back to our original question. Is free will all about our actions? Is it all in our minds? Or is it something else entirely?
I think it's more like this beautiful, messy blend of both, don't you?
Yeah.
Our actions in the world, they shape who we become, and our inner world, those thoughts and beliefs, shape the choices we make. It's this dynamic interplay.
So after exploring all these different ideas about free will, from Aristotle's take on voluntary actions to the Stoics' focus on inner harmony, where do we even land? It feels like we've been wrestling with a pretty complex puzzle, but it's definitely one worth thinking about.
I think you're absolutely right. It is complex, and honestly, maybe that's the whole point. Maybe it's less about finding a clear-cut answer to this question, do we actually have free will or not? And more about appreciating all the subtle shades of gray, the back and forth between the choices we make and the forces that are shaping those choices.
It's like we've been expanding our understanding of what freedom even means. Maybe it's not about having total control over every single thing in our lives,
Yeah.
but more about recognizing those areas where we do have some agency, where we can actually make choices that reflect our values,
Yeah.
you know, choices that actually shape how we experience the world.
And don't forget that inner resilience the Stoics were talking about, that ability to face challenges, those bumps in the road, and even those moments where we feel kind of stuck.
Yeah.
Facing those things with a sense of grace and, a bit of wisdom to remember that even though we can't always control what happens to us, we always get to choose how we respond.
I'm thinking about that Stoic idea of aligning our will with the will of the universe. It sounds kind of out there, but I can see how it could be a really powerful way to live. What if, instead of always fighting against reality, we put more energy into understanding it? accepting the things we just can't change, and then working skillfully within those limitations.
It's a huge shift in perspective, I'll grant you that. But imagine the freedom we could find by letting go of this need to control every little thing. What if, instead of trying to make the world bend to our will, we focused on really understanding ourselves and the forces that are at play in our lives?
I love that. It's like we're being invited to join this cosmic dance, learning the steps, understanding the rhythm, and moving with the flow of things instead of resisting it.
Exactly.
Maybe that's where real freedom is, not in domination or control, but in harmony and acceptance.
What a beautiful way to put it. And the amazing thing is that this ancient wisdom is still so relevant today, even though it's been around for thousands of
Oh,
years.
yeah.
In a world that often feels chaotic and kind of overwhelming, these philosophies offer us these really practical tools for navigating the complexities of life, for making choices that align with who we want to be, and for living in a way that feels more meaningful.
I'm walking away from this deep dive feeling inspired. I feel energized and honestly, maybe even a little more free. Hopefully, our listeners are feeling the same way.
Absolutely. And if there's one thing we hope you take away from all of this, it's a sense of curiosity and wonder about this whole crazy, messy thing we call life. Keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep making choices that align with who you want to be in the world.
That's it for this episode of The Deep Dive. We'll see you next time. But until then, keep pondering those big questions. And remember, you have more power to shape your own destiny than you might think.